Bé, bona tarda a tothom. Moltes gràcies per venir. El debat és en anglès, així que, si us sembla, passaré a l'anglès directament. So thank you very much for your presence here at CIDOB. This is one of the events that we organized in the evening to discuss in our series, What is Going On in the World, which is a wide enough series for an international relations think tank, and where we discuss issues that affect our daily lives from the international perspective. This is the forum we gather on quite frequently. The idea is to have a lively discussion on, among the panelists and then with the audience in an hour and a half. So by 8 p.m. we should be done. Today's issue is confronting the trends of disinformation, fake news, the difficulty to articulate sound policies vis-a-vis these movements that are threatening the very essence of what we do as societies in informing public debates, and confronting these trends with a series of policy areas and policy issues that are global in their nature, but that are all of them, the three of them, confronted to these disinformation debates. This is the case for climate change. We'll have a discussion on how climate change is not affecting our daily lives, but is confronted to disinformation attitudes, and how disinformation is questioning whether climate exists or doesn't exist, and the political purpose of questioning the mere fact of climate change. Second, we will have a discussion on disinformation and migration. So to what extent disinformation permeates into the developments of migration and the events of migration, sometimes just making it look much bigger, or even at some point much more dangerous than it really is, and how this affects our perception on migration issues. And third, we will also discuss disinformation in health. And that is why we have three panelists today with us covering these three aspects of global issues, global agenda issues, which are all confronted to disinformation and trends and dynamics. So basically what we are trying to put forward today is a discussion on the mismatch between the consensus that we generate at the global level when building global agendas, and that is perhaps the case for the Global Compact on Migration, but it's also the case for the Paris agreements on climate change, so global agendas that are tackled globally, and how when you generate these agendas, when put into reality, when implemented, are confronted sometimes to fake news and disinformation which discredit these global agreements that have been reached. And of course here, the underlying premise, the underlying issue that we are trying to talk about today is also the role of populism, and how populism takes as a specific target issues that are easily to misinform about. And these three issues today are the ones that we are covering. So for that, what I suggest is that we move directly to our panelists. First, we will give the floor to Nora Kronig-Romero, who is Ambassador for Global Health at the Federal Office for Public Health of Switzerland. She will, as I said, discuss the public health issues and the relations with disinformation. Then we will move to Ayuso, who is a senior researcher here at CIDOB, who will be talking about mostly climate change. And then last but not least, Gonzalo Fanjul, who is also from ISGlobal, co-organizer of this initiative that we are having today here at CIDOB, but with other initiatives that we do together, the two organizations, who will be discussing mostly migration as Director of Research of porCausa and Director of Policy at ISGlobal. So with that, only a brief presentation. I suggest we move directly to health issues with Nora, and then for 10 minutes or so, and then we move to the other panelists, and then we start the discussion among ourselves. So Nora, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming to CIDOB.
Thank you very much. Buenas noches. My Catalan is still not so good. English. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. And since we're talking about misinformation and perception and how information is taken on by the public and the role it plays, I wanted tonight...
What is the...
Yeah, it's okay. Two?
No, here. Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. Can't you hear?
Is it okay?
Yeah, now they raise the volume. It's okay.
Or I should speak louder?
No, now it's fine.
Well, as I said, since we're talking tonight about misinformation, I do think that it has a lot to do with perception and how messages are perceived and received by the public. So I wanted to try something that I haven't ever done before, so please bear with me on the technical side of it. I opened an Instagram account a few weeks ago, and I would invite the ones of you who do have an account to follow me, because I put up a little quiz on that I will also show on the PowerPoint there, so that we can have a bit of an interactive example of how information works in Switzerland. My name is Nora Kronig, so if you look me up on Instagram, you should find me easily, and I look exactly the same as I look here. First question is, how much of the Swiss population do you think receives subsidies from the public sector to pay for their health insurance? Less than 5%? More than 5%? It's approximately 25%. Why did I take that example? Because I think that we're always perceived as a very high income country, which is of course true, with a high quality healthcare system. We have compulsory insurance, so everybody is covered. And still, it's actually quite impressive to think that 1/4 of the Swiss population is actually not able to pay the premiums fully that they should pay for their healthcare insurance. Second question, how many hospitals do we have? We're about 8.5 smaller than Finland. We have quite similar levels of healthcare systems. Do you think it's less? Do you think it's more? We actually have 281 hospitals in Switzerland. Finland has less than we do, whilst they have a huge territory. And then I put up Catalonia as well. Don't want to compare our countries, know that it might be a bit tricky to do so. But 213 for a territory that is approximately the same, a little bit less, and a population that is approximately the same, a little bit less. Quite a huge challenge. We have a lot of hospitals, very difficult to merge, very difficult to try to adapt our system. Brings me to the third and the last questions. We tend to vote a lot in Switzerland, vote on a lot of different issues. Put up a few topics that we might have voted on. We had to vote a few months ago to know if the horns on our cows should be something mandatory or not. Is that fake news? Is that true? We did have to vote on having more vacations. Is that true? Is it something that we really did vote on? And then quite interesting to know what the result was. And then last week, one of the part of Switzerland voted on merging 3 hospitals. They're actually 20 kilometers away from each other, so it's about 25 minutes drive. Result of the vote, it was rejected because the population decided that they didn't want to go into that merge. It wasn't shutting down hospitals. They were all going to stay open. The idea was just to bring together services, be a bit more efficient about the way to use the resources, and it didn't go through in popular vote. It was just a little quiz on the perception on how do we actually link information. it's obvious, and everybody in Switzerland knows that our healthcare system costs a lot. Everybody in Switzerland, or at least 1/4 of the population, is struggling with financing healthcare because they receive subsidies from the states. We do have a huge network of hospitals. Still, you might think that a vote would then go to a positive outcome in merging issues, but it actually then takes into account way more parameters, way more opinions. And I do think that it's actually quite a good example on, is that misinformation? Can we say that? Or are the people who voted that maybe not informed enough or not interested enough? I don't think that. I never think that in Switzerland you can pretend, because the result of one vote is not necessarily the one of your opinion, that it's because people didn't know what they were voting for. But there were very intense discussions beforehand, showing all the arguments, all the different sides, and then you have the whole context that comes into it, and that brings results that are actually a consensus among the population. I just wanted to show you that, to maybe kind of like give a bit of a gist on what it means to have information and then what you do with it. I actually don't believe in perfect information, and I know that we're talking about misinformation tonight, but I do think that information is actually the basis to get to a position and to find consents and to take decisions and to discuss among us. I know that we were asked beforehand to maybe also come up with solutions. What could we do in order for information to be useful, to be something that is positive for society, that for the example of health actually really helps us to have the best healthcare system at the minimum cost with a very sustainable way of doing so. And for me, I think 3 things are important. I think that since information is the basis for us to take decisions, I also think that it's at the core of discussing and dialogue. And in the end, the important part is exchanging arguments, exchanging opinions, and be able, on the basis of that, to form opinions. And I don't think that an opinion is right or wrong. I think it's the result of a discussion and a way of presenting arguments and countering them. The second thing I do really strongly believe in, and that maybe goes a bit on also talking about populism, I do think that it's the responsibility of each and every one of us, especially when you're working for government, to tell the truth. I think it's very dangerous not to do so, and I do think that it's never a good thing to actually try not to talk about issues and not to put them out there. And the third thing that I do think that is for me something very important is to be precise. I think that we owe it to ourselves, but also to what we do and to the topics that we try to bring further, to really be precise and really dig into the information we have, try to get the best idea that we can, and get the best understanding possible of issues. So I will leave it at there and be very happy and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. So I'm not going to move directly to...
Sorry. I think it's this. Espera. No, això com es...
Això és teu o no?
No.
Ah, això no és teu.
Com es passa l'altre?
No, aquí.
Aquí, aquesta.
Aquesta?
Sí, aquesta. Què?
No, espera.
Yeah, it's this one.
Well, my topic is climate change and misinformation in the context of the 2030 agenda. As you know, the 2030 agenda was approved by United Nations to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a commitment to promote the inclusive and sustainable development at national and international level for the next 15 years. This agenda was addressed not only for the states, but also for the citizens. It's a commitment that includes everybody. So in the center of the SDGs, the environmental issues have a central place, because with the advancement of the scientific knowledge about the degradation of the environment and its consequences on the planet and the people lives, so it became a priority. So the SDGs include this action against climate change as a central part of the protection of public goods. In parallel with the SDGs, it was approved the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And it entered into force in 2016, and nowadays more than 126 countries ratified the treaty. And the central goal of this agreement is to decrease the temperature of the planet, and so to become to more or less the same temperatures than it was in the pre-industrial levels. To do that, we have to reduce the carbon emissions. So this agreement that commits to all the countries to join the effort to reduce this carbon emissions and to advance in measures that meet the energetic transition. So, but as you know also, some of the governments that already signed the treaty then now refuse to ratify them, like for example United States or Brazil, that are not small countries, so it's an important thing. But why they do, as I say, the scientific community have a consensus on that the climate change is a fact. 90% of the studies about climate change corroborate that there is a nexus between the emissions of carbons of human action and global warming. It's just a big consensus. This is just a study that joined different studies joined by different sources. So we have this big consensus, and also we have thousands of studies that clearly puts on the direction connections between the emission of carbon gases with global warming. So why still there are people who defend that doesn't exist? The campaign against climate change poses some questions, some key questions about that. Who is doing that? What are they doing that? And why? And of course, one of the first pointed on are the media. No? The media are often given credit to those who deny this climate change with sensationalist headlines. And this question the ethics of this media that covering this non-contrasted information in the name of freedom of expression sometimes. It's true that there are some self-regulatory bodies and ethics commissions, but many of them doesn't work. For example, you can see an example here. This is a newspaper that recognized that they have that admitted that the information about climate change was false, but the headline was like this, and then the apologize was a small part at the end of the journal. So this is a reality that exists, and it's very difficult to fight against that, because the legal or coercive instruments that we have are not working and doesn't reach to the majority of the population. You have the reputation of the media, no? It's something that they try to conserve, but for some of them it's not so important, and for part of the population it doesn't work neither. And especially when you have politicians that repeat the same messages that these newspapers do, like, for example, the case of the Trump administration. Not only the president, but the vice president and the secretary of state, they deny the existence of the climate change, and they continue to question this problem. No? But also Brazil, as you know, Bolsonaro is the new president of Brazil. It's a pity because Brazil was the country that hosted the first summit, the summit of sustainable development in 1992, and then there was the piece to start with the first agreement on climate change, that was the protocol of Kyoto. So this country that usually was a very committed country in environmental issues, and was one of the BRICS that was really aligned with Europe and other countries committed with this compromise. But now Bolsonaro wants to allow the unlimited exploitation of the Amazon forest. So this could accelerate dramatically the deforestation of the country, and this could have really no consequences on climate change. So this is the price he pays to the cattle lobby in Brazil that helped him to win the presidential election, and he needs them to govern now. So this is the price, why they do, no? But there are not only politicians, we have also think tanks that are devoted especially to deny the climate change. We have here both two examples. The Desmond think tank that he leads a crusade to deny the global warming, and we have also this other one, the CWPF, that he calls for a common sense on climate change, denying it. So this is quite cynical, no? To talk about common sense about denying the climate change. So certainly this is part of the information. We have other think tanks and international institutions that are spreading information about the climate change and the danger of this, but the doubts that these journals and think tanks and politicians have an effect in the public opinion, especially if the measures, the political measures, affect them. This is the case, for example, of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest in France. Of course, they have a lot of other questions they are against, but the trigger factor was really this tax, the increase in the tax of gasoline. So this makes us to have to put a question, to learn some lessons about the politicians that don't take into account the consequences in the population. The cost of the energy transition should not be charged in the poorest people's shoulders. So we have to think different ways to deal with these questions. On the other hand, going back to the information or the importance of the information, we can find here a map made by Gallup that it's about the knowledge, not the knowledge, the knowledge about the importance of the climate change. And you can see that the difference between the North and the South. In the North, there are more information, they know more the consequences or the possible consequences about climate change than in the South. But in the South, they have more, they suffer more the consequences of this climate change. If you see the next one, this is about the vulnerability that people feel about climate change. And here you feel a little bit different. It's fine. It's nice to see, for example, in the United States, they have more information about the climate change dangers, but they feel that they are less vulnerable to these changes. And in Brazil, they have less information about, but they feel more vulnerable. That's something interesting. So the information still is a difference. And finally, not only information is important, because here you can see the influence of the ideology in the United States, the difference between Democrats and Republicans regarding the climate change problem. It's clear, isn't it? The Republicans are less concerned than democracy. And then let us to a final question, is that how we react in front of the information. No? Sometimes it seems that we prefer to keep with the more comfortable truth. And we have to ask them, we have to ask how we can convince the people to accept the uncomfortable truth of climate change. That's it.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I will not use I will just make some remarks, and I hope that they can help for the conversation later. It's funny because just a couple of weeks ago we had some of you were present in a conversation that we had here in this same room about the role of think tanks in the public debate, and a lot of what we are saying is related to what we said then. How do you foster an informed, intelligent conversation on the basis of data, on the basis of facts, rather than on the basis of emotions, if you want to put it that way, sometimes open lies or distortions, and this is something a challenge that we face in each of the areas of public interest that each of us may be involved in. Just yesterday, we had what I believe is a day we will remember for many years in our parliament here in Spain, where the national budget was defeated. In the middle of a conversation that was focused on just a few elements of the many different issues that were involved in that budget that we didn't have the chance to discuss at all. All the different elements that I am involved in, from global health to AIDS to climate to migration to child poverty, all of those had positive news in a budget that was defeated and in a public debate on the budget that had nothing to do with those issues. It is a noisy public debate. It is a distorted public debate. It is a partial public debate. And some issues are simply sidelines. And I would argue that, for instance, child poverty is an example of that. This is to me a paramount example of an issue. You know that 1 out of 3 children in our country live in poverty or social exclusion. This is an issue that was not part of the public debate just up to a few years ago. Right now, is still marginalized in the. But the issue that I want to talk about, migration, is a completely different one. We are talking about migration almost every day. Migration has become has managed to get in the center of the public debate. Maybe, well, in Spain more recently, and right now this is part of but certainly in other European countries, certainly in the United States, in Australia, migration, in my view, is a paramount example of a obscenely distorted, manipulated debate, disinformed, first of all, based on myths, based on lies that affect who comes, how, and on what legal capacity, about the costs and the social and economic impact of migration, about migration and criminality and the links between migration and terrorism and delinquency, above all about the very reasons why people move, and therefore about the kind of policies that should be implemented in order to address the migration challenge. No? Moreover, I believe that the migration debate is an example of a debate that is focused in just a very minor corner of a much broader challenge. If you had to ask, if we made that Instagram example that you did with the European population, for instance, in terms of who is a migrant and how they come, most of them will probably refer to the refugees or to the people that are coming through our southern frontier or to the. But we do know by the facts that those people are actually 1 out of 10 people that move in the global context. 26 million refugees out of almost 270 million people that live as migrants in essentially an order-regulated legal framework that has nothing to do with the humanitarian emergency that we have created out of that. No? This has, as I said before, extraordinary consequences in the way we deal with the challenge of migration. It is obvious that we have a unilateral position based on the idea that we are being invaded and that this is a problem that we need to solve. This is true for those that want to stop migration and for those that consider that migration is restricted to a humanitarian problem, and therefore we should be helping people rather than just governing what is essentially a natural process. But I would argue that this goes far beyond migration. I think that if you look at the Brexit debate as an example, something that started not just, but where migration had a major role at the beginning, has had consequences that go far beyond that. And if you look at Donald Trump's discourse, if you look at, I don't know, whatever you want to look, the way migration has been used as a leverage to open many other agendas, I think it's tragic, no? But anyway, I think that in the diagnosis, I think that we all agree that we have a problem. Let me devote 5 minutes to some of the solutions that I have spent with colleagues some time trying to think of migration, trying to think of migration as, in a sense, a laboratory for how to build new narratives in this public debate. And the examples that both global health, our health, and climate are also, I think, very, very important laboratories. No? And these are some of the things that we have learned that I would like to share with you. First of all, there are 3 golden rules in terms of engaging in a public conversation on migration. The first one is try to avoid, by any means, the us versus the other. The idea that there are 2 parts on this. I just want to emphasize that this is something that somebody that is against migration would do in terms of presenting migration as a menace, as a threat, but this is also true for those that consider migration just a humanitarian issue where you put the migrants in a position that is far below you. It's someone that you help in a vertical rather than an equal in a common identity, in a common sense of citizenship. So the us versus them polarizes, separates, victimizes, so there are a number of problems related to that. Second rule, focus on emotions rather than data. The data is critical, the facts are critical. I would argue that they are a necessary condition, you cannot lie, but by no means they are a sufficient condition. We need to focus on the emotions. This is where we are, I believe, losing the battle in this regard. Data is not remembered. Data can be easily denied, even in an open space, even for issues. I think that the examples that have been put today, the examples that Anna used for the climate debate, I think is a very good example. No matter if you have 97% of the scientific community saying one thing. In this regard, I disagree with you, Nora. Not every opinion is acceptable. Some opinions are wrong. So this is not just my opinion, not my opinion, the opinion of the 97 scientists is not the same as the 3 that are, and maybe we can discuss that later, no? So avoid the us versus them. Second, sentiments over data. Third, do not react, do not quote. Try to open new conversations rather than engage and answer the conversations that have been opened from the wrong side, no? And I tell you this in a very emphatic way, but I myself, I am an example of what not to do in this public debate. Just a few days ago, I engaged in a Twitter battle regarding an article that had been published in El Mundo in Spain by a journalist called Ángeles Escribá, which was an open lie. To be honest, it was the Ministry of Interior of Spain telling a journalist a bunch of lies, and the journalist just putting them in a major national newspaper without any kind of filter. And rather than doing what Ocasio-Cortez has showed us to do, I recommend you to read an article in The Guardian about how Ocasio-Cortez reigns, is the queen of Twitter, how she's fantastic in terms, and one of the things that she does very well is to engage in conversations without copying, linking the origin of the fake news. You can just take a copy in your computer, but you do not link, you do not spread the lie more in the. So well, the thing is that this was one of my most successful Twitters that I've ever had. It was a very long one, and Ángeles Escribá is very popular in part because of me and my stupidity, no? But the first framework wins, and I think that it is in a context where people tend to believe tend to read what they believed in the first place, tend to look for information that re-emphasizes what they already thought. This is extremely important. No? These are the 3 golden rules. Sorry, I finished. 4 tools that we use on the basis of these 3 rules. First of all, we are working on subconscient perception. This is something that I am learning about, that I am fascinated with. We worked with a couple of demoscopic organizations, one of them Metroscopia, that they used to do the opinion polls for El País, and we did with them a poll on what people think about migration. And it was interesting because most of the rational response in a poll, in a formal poll like this, was extremely positive. Spaniards are clearly above the rest of the Europeans in terms of what we think about migrants, on what we think about refugees, welcome refugees, we want more people, we want diversified societies. But then we did, using a Harvard methodology that is called the implicit association test, we did a test with 2,500 people looking at the subconscious reaction when you ask some of the same questions. And this is something that I can share with you the methodology if you are interested in this. This methodology allows you to understand what people think in their guts rather than in their rational response. And the result was completely the opposite. Actually, the result was very similar to that in the rest of Europe, that we fear migration. No matter if we think that we should do more for refugees, we tend to think of migration either as a threat or as a problem. In any case, a problem. That is when we look at what is happening in our country, and we look at Andalusian elections and the rise of the extreme right, and many people say, where were these people? Well, these people were always there. We never were anything different than the rest of. We have other toys to play with, different than other European countries. But the fact is that we are not different in that regard. No? So how we operate in that level, the subconscious level, is a fundamental one. We are, and this is the second tool, we are exploring the idea of substitutive narratives. Sorry, my macaronic English, maybe this substitutive narrative doesn't exist, but substitutive, so do not engage in a conversation that the bad people, the wrong guys are opening. Try to open a new conversation about what you actually know. Migration might be about some Arab terrorists trying, some of the 10 million Arab terrorists like Pablo Casado mentioned in Melilla that are hiding in Nador waiting to jump the fence, and it might be that. But it's most likely that migration resembles more what you know, which is the people that you work with, the friends of your children in the school, the people that works in your house. That is a completely different narrative about what migration brings to our society. And that is linked to our personal experience, which is, by the way, the third tool that we use. Make it local, make it personal. Try to take it away from a debate that is contaminated, for instance, at the national level, and try to make it local. That's why I am so keen in involving improbable actors such as private companies, cities, actors that maybe did not have such a strong say in the previous phases of this debate, but right now they are critical in introducing. In the US, for instance, it's really interesting the way cities are intervening in the migration debates in a way that changes completely the national government's narrative. No? And finally, the fourth tool, what we call the Coca-Cola effect. If we want to win this debate, we need to use the tools, for instance, the marketing tools, the good marketing tools. We are working in building a brand book of migration. We want to explore those arguments that would appeal to your emotions in the way Coca-Cola appeals to your emotions. No? And I know this is very ambitious, but the fact is that the other people are doing it very effectively, and they have been able to build, to construct a framework of narrative framework of migration on that basis. No? So I finish just by saying that this is clearly a battle that we are losing. Clearly, we are moving backwards very, very quickly. We are reopening things that, as this book of Muñoz Molina that said everything that was solid, no? Everything that was solid now is being diluted and we are reopening things. We are reconsidering now in the most civilized societies in the world whether a child should be sent back to a country, whether we should ignore rules that have been with us for 50 years. No? And so it is clear that we are losing this debate. No? The question is, rather than trying to win this debate, is it possible that we open a different conversation? Is it possible that we try to engage in a different battle in this regard? And I think the narrative one is a fundamental one. No? I leave you with that. Sorry.
Okay, gracias. Thanks. I think that there were a few very interesting thoughts here that we can engage on. I have three questions, like one for each, but maybe there are plenty more here around the room. First of all, I think one of them is easy, and I targeted to Nora because it's actually Gonzalo's question. But I mean, to what extent is it really the case then that what Gonzalo mentioned is that all opinions are equal? I mean, to what extent should we treat all opinions on health issues, for that matter, based on misconceptions or on understandings that things are different than what reality tells you, that what data tells you, and to what extent then by providing real data and alternative data can you change this mindset on the issues that are misconceived on public health? Because I think that this is something that is in all the circumstances quite similar. And to Anna, I think I was interested in your the way you mentioned how disinformation often targets climate change as a fact, and it denies the mere existence of climate change. This is exactly what Trump does. Trump goes out and says, oh, look, it's very cold in Chicago these days. This means that climate change doesn't exist. Where data tells you exactly that it is precisely because of global warming and climate change that you will get waves of cold much higher and much more pronounced, precisely because of the effects of global warming. And he goes to the mere fact of saying, look, it's cold, it isn't hot. That's all as far as it gets for him. But that's exactly what he puts forward. My question always with climate change is, and I put that question to you, but I don't know if there's an easy answer, is isn't it much easier to deny the effects of climate change? And here there is contestation. There is contestation on data, and there are different studies that say, well, climate change exists, fine, but we're not sure whether climate change is a threat for next year, for in 10 years' time, or in 20 years' time, or 50 years' time. And maybe if it is in 50 years' time, then the capacity of technology, the capacity of nature, the capacity of many aspects out there to adapt to climate change will make the effects of climate change much less important or much less pronounced that we would say. So to me, the denial of climate change, why do you tackle the denial of the fact that climate change exists instead of tackling the fact that perhaps climate change is not so important or it's not so, so dangerous? And here, maybe you have a different way of approaching without recurring to basic, well, I was about to say a word that I shouldn't be pronouncing here, but basic misunderstandings on climate change, instead of saying, well, we don't know how climate change will affect us. And this is perhaps much more useful as a frame for discussion, but this is something that I've always wondered. I don't know if you have an answer for that. And to Gonzalo, finally, I was very interested with your last point, but I want to challenge it a bit. You said, change the frameworks of the discussion. And I think that's a very, very relevant way to approach the migration issue and how we think about migration. If you think about migration for instance, living here and working here, I live close by and I work here. So every day, my daily commute, which is 5 minutes walk or 10 minutes walk, it's basically around this neighborhood where there is migration. If I think about migration on that sense, there is no problem at all with migration for me. And I see, okay, this is my normal life, this is my daily life, it doesn't pose any problem, so I should be focusing on that framework of migration, my personal experience, as you mentioned, instead of focusing on the constructed news on migration, terrorism, danger, and so on and so forth. So I think that that's an excellent way to tackle this. My question comes what happens then when there is contestation within those groups? So basically what I'm asking is, what about in those cases where there is, for instance, a struggle for public services and there is some kind of benefit and bad consequences of fighting for scarce resources? How do you change the mindset of those who experience migration not as a threat, not as a terrorist, not as a security issue, but rather as a daily life problem with whom you have to compete, for better or for worse? I'm not putting any identity questions in here. I'm not putting any considerations on whether you should be focusing on the difference or we are all equal, we're all different. No, leave those questions aside. Focus on those where there is actually socio-economic struggle. How do you tackle those sectors of population that eventually see more competition? Migration or not migration, I don't care, but more competition. And since resources are scarce, then how do you tackle those situations? These are my 3 questions. They're very broad, but I don't know if you want to take them or I should just open the floor to the rest of the audience. Do you want to say a word? Or
yeah. You said it was an easy question. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's an easy question. You asked me, I will not enter into that debate.
Go ahead. He's running. I see him running, so I think that...
This one?
Yeah.
I really do not think that we should enter into this debate of good and bad opinions. And I'm not talking about the really, really, really extreme dimensions that are unacceptable and that have been unacceptable for many years now. But I think that, interestingly enough, and it struck me a bit when you were pushing your points, I think that we entered into a phase where vocabulary is becoming very extreme, even when we tend to make the opposite point. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that we should actually try to to have a scale on the good opinions and the bad opinions and the the things that are right or wrong. I think it's a matter of having a discussion, putting facts on the table. I'm not saying that we shouldn't put the facts. I found it quite interesting what was said about emotions. I think it's then always a bit of a clinch between facts and emotions. We tend to not link both, but I think it's intrinsically linked to a certain extent. And I also think that one of the phenomena that we haven't talked about yet is everything that has to do with too much information and the acceleration of information. In itself, it's more a matter also on what do you do with the immensity of information that we get every day. How do we deal with the fact that we tend to go for even shorter, even crispier, even most liked information, and how do we get along with that? And to come back to the question of how do we deal with misconceptions and how we then advance policies, I don't think it's a Coca-Cola effect that we should seek, because I don't think that it's a matter of giving the people the impression that what is happening is good for them and then not think about what they are liking the Coca-Cola. I think it really is a matter of convincing and getting a social agreement and contract on what we should actually go for and how to frame it. And in that extent, I think we should get out of this discussion of it's good and it's bad and what they said was horrible and this person is very populistic and it's whatever. If I go back to the example of this vote we had on this hospital merging, there were actually a lot of public discussions on a lot of issues around that. And I do think that since there is so much information, so much media around, so much the topic of the moment, that is something that we all are challenged with, but you still get around those topics discussions where you actually exchange arguments, ideas, opinions, and I do think that in itself then brings to the best results, instead of just, going from one way or the other and not having those merging parts coming up and agreeing on consensus.
It works, mine? Yeah, I think it works. So, well, that's a difficult question, yes. But I think there are two questions, because it's not the same if you deny the existence of the climate change than if you talk about the consequences of this climate change. Regarding the climate change reality, you have to go to the scientific knowledge. It's the only way to prove that exists. So this is really, it's not something that emotions or things like that, it's exist or not exist. One thing is, what is the causes of that or the consequences of that? This is what the most of the people who deny the action against climate change focus. No? That is, the causes are not human, but it's a natural cause, so you don't need to do anything because it's out of our possibility. And the other thing is the consequences. The consequences, yes, of course, it will have some, but it will be 15 years ago or I don't know, 20 or I don't know. So you have the time to take it with calm and to change slowly. But here, the only way to change the people, the conscience of that or the problem that it's to put the day-to-day consequences of the climate change. So to put to point the direct consequences in your own life. That is now. No? It's, so I think this is the way to have this sentimental or emotional reaction to the danger, and not only these catastrophes you say catastrophes, they occur, but never to me. But the day-to-day things, problems that you will have if we don't act against that. And the other way is also to point out also which are the specific measures we can do against that. So that's something that we can do, we can reach to do, and you can ask the politician to do. This is the way that you feel involved in that, because it's something that is something we can do anything against that. So we say it's more comfortable to stay at home and to say and sit and and wait and see what happens.
Just a couple of things before I answer your question on the opinions I do think there are opinions that are wrong, but my point is not whether we should exclude some opinions or not, but on what opinions, on what information do we build public policies? What drives the public narrative when it comes to the kind of issues that we are talking about, no? And in this regard, let me come back to one of the issues that we talked a couple of weeks ago, which is the role of the intermediary. So how is it that we discriminate within the noise? How is it that we are able to establish informed opinions? And in this regard, that's why I work in a think tank. I believe that the role of think tanks is extremely important, and we know it very well in the global health area. But it goes back to the role of the media that we have. Rafa Vila San Juan and myself, we talk a lot about the role of media in this debate. There was a fantastic. Sorry, I come back to the Guardian, but there was a fantastic editorial in the Observer. I don't know when, a few weeks ago, about how a few think tanks, it had been proved, had openly lied during the Brexit debate. They were completely opaque. They were unwilling to confess who was financing the research. They were, and some of the media had directly bought the arguments that intermediary that used to play a fundamental role in terms of discriminating what is true from what is false, but certainly what is relevant from what is not. That to me is critical. No? In terms of your question, Paul, this is the fact. The fact is that, and I recommend you this Global McKinsey Institute report, which is a fantastic literature review on that. The fact is that between 70 and 80% of all the wealth created in key destination countries between 2000 and 2015 was directly related to migration. Migrants were critical in terms of reducing fiscal deficits, in terms of creating employment, in terms of increasing when this did not happen was because migrants, as opposed to what many of our governments think, they are not imbecile, and they know where to go, and they know when not to go to, and that is the explanation why in Spain in 2008 the number of migrants, the net increase in migrants goes down below the floor. No? We know for a fact that our economy increases in that regard, but we know that not everybody wins equally. So the critical question is, how do we go from this fact to that people that you are describing? No, well, this is not an easy question at all. The first thing that comes to my mind is about leadership and how do we redistribute, how do we, I know the case of Madrid where I live, the economy of Madrid during the decade between 1998 and 2018 increased alongside with migration by almost 15%. The expenditure in public services remains, in relative terms, remains frozen. Sorry, in absolute terms, remains frozen. That is, it did not reflect a society that had changed. So at the end of the day, this is the first thing that happens. The other thing is that is about something that I struggle with in this debate, which is how do we build common causes? common identities. The people that are losing out of these policies are very much the same that are people of the migrant people that are losing out of the very same policies. How do we build common identities rather than trying to pursue progress in slots, no? In closed spaces, no? Again, the Brexit debate, I think, is a very interesting debate in this regard. If you look at what social democrats at the Socialist Party is doing in the Brexit debate, is choosing to focus on the progress of those that are within a closed circle rather than considering how do you fight for the right of workers in the 21st century, how to build common identities in a hyper-fragmented environment where identities are broken in every. I'm thinking about Morillas' book, the Once and Future Liberal, that explains very well our difficulties to build that identity. To me, those are the kind of questions that which are not easy ones. I agree, and I know that I'm not responding you. No.
It turned red, so I think it's dying. I fully agree on the fact that in itself it's a matter of how do we actually design policies and then implement them. And of course they should and have to be strongly evidence-based, right? But that's the work of then designing the policy and implementing it. And I think we are then in all the topics confronted with the attention that is to a certain extent an exterior factor, but it's still a public action around states, around common organizations that link the citizens. So you have to deal and take into account that attention to a certain extent. And one thing that I find quite interesting, if I take the example of health and not of migration, because I think it's a different one, is that it's actually very sad to say so, but crises are a good thing for global health in terms of institutions, because when you have a huge Ebola crisis in 2014, that all the media in Europe is talking about it, that I think in Spain you had a few very scary cases, then what happens? It gives more public attention to it, more spending, and what do you see as a result? You have WHO who then also adapts structures to actually make sure that it doesn't happen anymore. When you had a plague epidemic in Madagascar last year, I don't even know if anybody in the room heard about that, because it was dealt with properly, nothing happened, it didn't really go into a crisis modus, and then the attention is not there anymore. Yeah. And I think this equilibrium and finding the path on how to deal with those kind of different logics is very tricky.
Good. So we should perhaps open it up if there are questions in the audience. Does anyone have the solution to our debates? That would be very useful. No? Two solutions.
Is it on? Yes. Hello, my name is Maike. I work for the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Great debate, thank you. I wish we had this kind of debate in Germany as well, from different sectors, from different fields. Very interesting. Maybe one example from Germany, and maybe a little solution, just a small one. When the compact, the global compact on migration was discussed in Germany, there was a lot of wind from the far right against it, and also from the public, and also the parties, the Christian Union, for example. And I think the biggest problem was that the debate around the Global Compact on Migration was too late, because we had the public debate when the compact was presented in Morocco. So when the compact was already there was no public engagement before that. So maybe a little solution is engage the public earlier, even though it's uncomfortable. Like you said in the beginning. Like, I think it was a little bit the fear of policymakers and also academics to have this uncomfortable public debate with the public. And that's why it was so difficult in the end.
Hi, my name is Oriana Ramirez, and I work in global health issues at ISGlobal. I wanted to bring the example of vaccines to the table, and how I think what Gonzalo was saying about not building a us versus them debate that's not helpful at all. I believe media and public health officers here in Spain are building that debate that anti-vaccines are there and they are against all vaccines, and they are, and while we have the facts and scientific facts that they work, and no one is really listening to the reasons behind anti-vaccines as a group. They are very diverse. There are people that accept only some of them. There are people that are willing to vaccine their children when they go outside to a developing country. For example, there are facts there that can be used to build a more wise debate, while media is also lying. There are some measles outbreaks that are not only due to anti-vaccines movements, but just people that are not anymore, certain ages that are not covered anymore because vaccines were not effective. So I believe we need to listen also, right, to the people that don't think as us, and build facts and arguments around that, because we may find a common ground, I believe.
Hi, my name is Kige, and I'm a journalist, the ones to blame for the spreading of fake news, because it's one issue that you were talking about now. And I wanted to point, because it's something that, since I started to study these issues about disinformation from a geostrategical point of view, if in which level we journalists are responsible on that, in the sense that we, as a professionals, didn't define which are the quantitative and qualitative methods in order to conclude that an information it's true or not. Because nowadays we saw a lot of resources in order to debunk total creations, fake news of something that doesn't exist, for example. But on contrary, for example, if you talk with a historian or an anthropologist, they define their own tools, their own epistemological tools to base their own conclusions on a good epistemological basis, while we journalists, we pick someone who has an opinion on some issue and another one who has exactly the contrary opinion, and we ask the reader to form their own opinion. That is something that from an epistemological point of view is completely absurd. I mean, and I think that it will be interesting, because I wrote an article of Elizabeth Bruering in Washington Post pointing precisely that point, that it is not enough just to check if the facts are true or not, to make this fact-checking review. Nowadays, regarding on more complex issues, regarding, for example, migrations or whatever, journalists must have their own epistemological tools in order to don't confuse correlation with causation, for example, or to define, a good epistemological basis in order to deal with that facts. And I think that as a journalist, we have this responsibility in order to open this debate on that issue.
Any more? That is the critical discussion with the role of the BBC in Brexit, precisely, right? And it was the BBC should present arguments in favor of Brexit and arguments against Brexit, so that the informed citizen should take the best decision based on facts. And then the truth is that, sorry, I'm just misbehaving as a chair here, but the truth is that part of the story, so the ones who were defending Brexit was a good thing. Most of the arguments were based on fake news and fake facts, right? So to what extent should you put forward a very frank discussion between pro and against when one of the sides is telling lies, basically, pure lies, and you are giving it the opportunity to present that as one reality that has to be chosen between the two of the citizen, right? Who can listen to one or the other, and then the facts tell you that they were wrong. But I think that's an excellent discussion for a journalist to be had. Well, there's another question, and then sorry.
Hello, my name is Michaela Dold from the Credit Institute in Geneva Global Health Center. So I'm just interested to see a little bit the interlinkages between the different policy arenas, because you have talked about climate change, global health, migration, and looking at solutions in that. What you can see very clearly is disinformation in all three policy areas. So my question is, what is the common denominator? Where one can actually, where one policy arena can inform the other, or where actually these different areas which are acting in silos very much often, can come together and act together. So is it a change? Gonzalo, you talked about new conversations, new narratives which we have to build. So in some ways you could also talk about a new framing which we need to give it. And if, of course, one common framing you can find in all three is security as a common framing. Now that's a very dangerous framing in itself, especially in the migration debate. So you wouldn't want to go necessarily down that road. But what do you see as those, possible framings or the possible common denominators?
Yeah.
I actually think that one thing that I'm missing quite often is to have a bit of to not fall in this negative discussion and to talk about security and hard security and link the things in a complicated way and then complain about everything that does not go well. I do think that in all the three fields there have been very positive developments in the last years on international collaboration, exchange of information, public action against it, state action to find agreements, to bring them further. And I do think that the value is to discuss together and to bring it further. What I do think that would be useful is this part that has come out quite often tonight on the bad and the good and opinions and the bad and the good parts is something that we should kind of have there somewhere in our minds, but really engage and really try to find solutions, because in the end, I think the important thing is to get answers to the challenges. And I am personally really convinced it's of course easier when you are in charge of health to show everything that has been successful in the last 20, 30 years. If you look at how the world managed the HIV/AIDS crisis, for example, is actually quite fascinating how much we came along. I'm not saying it's solved, I'm not saying there's not something, still a lot of challenges out there that we have to tackle, but I do think that in the three fields, organizing public answers, right answers, exchange, and go into action and really find solutions is a good thing, and there we can probably help each other because they are all interlinked.
Yeah, just I agree with what it was. The Global Compact had the chance to be in Marrakesh and it was really a fantastic experience. In that regard, it was an experiment of how to build a public hysteria, a collective hysteria on the basis of something that did not really force governments to do anything. If you look at the actual Global Compact, it's just a playing field. Absolutely, it doesn't commit anybody to do anything unless they want to. In that, and I agree with your point. I think that part of this hysteria that was created in some European countries, like Austria, for instance, or Hungary, or the United States, might have been avoided with opening a debate that was precluded to a few elitist experts for the whole process. No? In terms of what you said, Oriana, the one nuance that I would make is that we need to distinguish between the individuals, the citizens, and the intoxicators. So there are people, as you say, that with the best faith, they think that they take a position. For instance, I think that vaccines is a very good example in that regard. And there are others that have vested interests that are very actively. I think that not alienating the first ones is as important as actively combating the sources of fake news in something that can actually drive us into serious public health risks, no? And I think that's important, no? In terms of the journalists, the question that was made I think this is critical, no? I think that there are a diversity of explanations, no? I am not a journalist myself, but I have an entomologist interest on journalism but part of that, I would say, there are some media that they are open liars, and this happens, and we know that. If you go to OK Diario, just to put an example in our own country, you know that, or if you go to some of the tabloids in the UK, or sometimes this is and that. But I would say that those are the exception, are the few. The main problem in most of the newsrooms, I think, across the world, as you probably know very well, is that the very model of journalism that we used to rely upon is in crisis. So now we have a serious problem of media that do not have the capacity to deepen into the issues the way maybe they used to, or maybe they never were able to do that. But the thing is that the kind of depth that we need for the current public debate is not in the hands of many media. From the experts, I'm thinking about health, an area where we work on. It's very rare now to have experts on health in a newsroom and on an issue that as relevant as that, even in national media. From that to the role of editors, for instance, the role that an editor or the complexity of the editorial work right now, I think is critical. No? In that regard, the good news to me is that the crisis of the conventional model is giving birth to a series of alternatives that I think are really interesting in this regard. I'm thinking about News Deeply, for instance. I don't know if you know the News Deeply is an initiative that is a non-for-profit organization, media organization, that what they do is to take a series of issues that they specialize on. So they have climate deeply, women deeply, refugees deeply. So you have a bunch of journalists specialize on that. They work with think tanks, they work with experts, they are people that really know. When these people ally with the media, with the conventional media, that alliance can be really powerful, but there has to be a complete change of culture on the side of the conventional media, that they have to get used to working with organizations that they are not used to, and there has to be also a change in the mind frame of citizens. We need to start to pay for that kind of journalism. We need to make sure that we are paying for that. No, I'm thinking. I was just noting down. I don't know if you know about forensic architecture, which is a fantastic initiative. They've been working with BBC, for instance. They use architecture analysis to identify what happens in conflicts, and well, there are many opportunities in this regard. No, and finally, just a brief comment on your question, Michela. I don't have a good answer for what you said. I can tell you something that is proving useful for us in terms of building this common narrative. Trying to build the idea of enlightened self-interest. So in each of the three issues that we are talking about, there is a possibility to combine intelligently values with interests in a way that can appeal to a broader audience. So we are not just talking to the people that agree with us, but to many other people that might be able to engage in this kind of debates for different reasons. No? For instance, we are doing that when we try to reconstruct the Spanish cooperation, Spanish aid system. We are trying to build on the argument that middle-sized countries like ours can have innate an extremely useful tool for soft power tool, as opposed to defense or economics or other areas where other countries and that's, I don't know if it resonates at all, but I think that is helping us to move forward.
On time. Just about this question about common questions about the fake news in the different questions, in the different issues. I think we have to difference in which are the reasons for this fake news and which are the way they work. Probably in the way they work are very similar. They use the same kind of instruments and methodologies and things like that. But in the reasons, there is the difference, because really, there could be problems about the crisis of the journalists, but I think most of the fake news are not by chance, are really intentional, and they are motivated but powerful interest of powerful actors. So one of the ways to fight against that is to unmask these connections, this spurious interest of the medias to use this to exploit this fake news. So in the case of climate change, it's evident that the oil companies, the car industry, and things like that. So it's this is the reason. For example, in medicines, it's different. It's the big pharmaceutical companies and other ones. So there are differences there, but the way they works, it's quite similar. I think this is the. I think we can change this, differentiate this.
Okay, so we've run out of time. We said 8 p.m., so it's 8 p.m. So thank you very much, Nora, for your visit to Barcelona first, and for accepting our invitation to CIDOB. Of course, thank you to Gonzalo and ISGlobal for still trusting us as a source of information, and Dana, of course, for participating from CIDOB, and thank you all for coming. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I think we were attempting into something which is quite difficult, to be honest, which is putting different policy areas or different subject matters under the same umbrella, and I think that's it's quite a challenge. But I think it was interesting the way the outcomes of our discussion. So thank you all. See you in the next on the next occasion here in our series of what's going on in the world. Thank you very much.